There is something deeply arresting about the sight of a round barn rising from the flat plains of the American Midwest. Most travelers who encounter one for the first time slow their vehicles instinctively, drawn by a silhouette that seems to belong more to a dream than to a working farm. The circle, after all, is not a shape that American agriculture made famous. The square, the rectangle, the grid, those were the geometries of homesteads, of townships, of the land survey system that carved the frontier into tidy parcels. And yet, scattered across Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Vermont, and dozens of other states, these circular structures stand as quiet monuments to a moment in agricultural history when a handful of farmers and reformers dared to ask whether the conventional barn, efficient as it seemed, was actually the best tool for the job. The answer they arrived at was radical, beautiful, and ultimately short-lived. But the story of why round barns were built, how they functioned, who championed them, and why they eventually faded from the American landscape is one of the most compelling footnotes in the history of rural life, and it deserves far more attention than it typically receives. To understand the round barn, you first need to understand the world that made it possible and the problems it was designed to solve. By the middle of the 19th century, American farming was undergoing a transformation of enormous scale. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast tracts of land to settlement, and with that settlement came the need to manage livestock, store hay, and organize labor across properties that were often operated by a single family with limited hired help. The conventional rectangular barn, with its multiple doors, its divided stalls, its hayloft accessible only by ladder or ramp, required a farmer to walk considerable distances in the course of a single day. Feeding 100 head of cattle in a rectangular barn meant moving along one wall and then back along another, carrying heavy feed, navigating tight corners, and repeating the circuit multiple times each morning and evening. It was physically exhausting work, and the barn itself, for all its familiarity, was not designed with labor efficiency as its primary concern. It was designed by tradition, built the way barns had always been built, because that was the shape lumber came in, that was the shape most carpenters knew how to construct, and that was the shape neighbors expected to see. The agricultural reform movement of the late 19th century challenged many of these assumptions directly. Land-grant universities, newly established under the Morrill Act of 1862, were beginning to apply scientific reasoning to farming practices. Professors of agriculture wrote pamphlets and delivered lectures arguing that the American farmer was working harder than he needed to, not because he lacked energy or dedication, but because his tools and structures had been inherited rather than designed. It was within this intellectual climate, one charged with the belief that science could improve every aspect of rural life, that the round barn began to receive serious consideration as a legitimate and superior alternative to its rectangular counterpart. The central argument for the round barn was elegantly simple. A circle encloses the maximum area for a given perimeter. In practical terms, this meant that a round barn could shelter the same number of animals and store the same amount of hay as a rectangular barn of equivalent wall length, while using significantly less building material. For a farmer operating on thin margins, the savings in lumber alone could be substantial. But the economic argument was only the beginning. The true genius of the round barn, as its advocates described it, lay in its operational logic. Picture a barn designed so that the haymow, the central storage area for feed, sits directly in the middle, surrounded by a circular ring of animal stalls, all of which face inward toward that central supply. A farmer entering such a barn with a pitchfork needs only to stand in one place and distribute feed in a complete rotation, covering every stall in a single circuit without ever retracing his steps. The labor savings were not trivial. On a large dairy operation, This design could reduce the time spent on daily feeding chores by a measurable portion of the working day, freeing up hours for other tasks across the season. Drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching this from, whether you are in a small town, a big city, or maybe even on a farm yourself. We read every single one. There is also the question of structural integrity, which the round barn addressed in ways that rectangular construction could not easily replicate. A circular wall distributes the load it bears far more evenly than a straight wall does. There are no corners where stress concentrates, no angles where wood is asked to carry more weight than the material around it. In regions where heavy snowfall could collapse a poorly engineered roof, the dome or conical roof of a round barn handled the burden with remarkable efficiency, directing weight down the curved walls and into the foundation rather than allowing it to accumulate at weak points. Some builders and farmers in tornado-prone regions of the Midwest also believed, though this claim was never definitively proven, that the round barn's lack of flat surfaces made it less susceptible to wind damage. Whether or not that specific assertion held up under meteorological scrutiny, the structural advantages of curved construction were real, and they were recognized by the engineers and architects who began studying round barns in the 1880s and 1890s. Among the earliest and most celebrated proponents of the round barn design was the Shaker religious community, whose influence on American craft and architecture extended far beyond their modest numbers. The Shakers, committed to principles of simplicity, efficiency, and beauty through function, constructed what is often considered the most iconic early round barn in America at their community in Hancock, Massachusetts. Built in 1826, the Hancock Shaker Round Barn, technically a polygon rather than a perfect circle, but close enough to be counted among the family, was designed to accommodate 52 head of cattle and was organized around a central space that allowed a wagon loaded with hay to drive directly inside and distribute feed without the load ever needing to be lifted by hand. The elegance of this solution was extraordinary. A single person driving a single wagon could complete the feeding of dozens of animals with minimal effort. The Hancock barn stood as a demonstration that the round form was not merely an aesthetic curiosity, but a genuine innovation in agricultural engineering, and it drew visitors and imitators for decades after its construction. The Shakers, however, were not alone in developing the concept. In the decades that followed the Civil War, a number of individual farmers across the Midwest began building round barns independently, sometimes drawing on published agricultural guides and sometimes working entirely from their own reasoning. One of the most prolific periods for round barn construction in the United States came between roughly 1880 and 1920, a window often described by historians of rural architecture as the golden age of the form. During those 4 decades, hundreds of round and polygonal barns were erected across the American heartland, particularly in Indiana, which today holds one of the largest surviving concentrations of round barns in the nation. And in Illinois, where the influence of the University of Illinois College of Agriculture made itself felt in the designs that local farmers adopted. The University of Illinois deserves particular credit for the propagation of the round barn in the Midwest. Beginning in the 1890s, faculty members at the university's Agricultural Experiment Station began publishing detailed plans for round and polygonal barns, complete with specifications for framing, ventilation, and floor layout. These plans were made available to farmers through extension bulletins, one of the earliest examples of what we would now call technology transfer from a research institution to everyday practitioners. Cyrus Thomas, Wilbur Fraser, and especially Benton Steele were among the figures associated with this movement, and their published designs were adopted by farmers across Illinois, Indiana, and beyond. Steele, in particular, became something of a missionary for the round barn, advocating the design through lectures and publications with an enthusiasm that blurred the line between scientific advocacy and genuine conviction. He believed, as many reformers of his era did, that the right design could genuinely transform the lives of farmers and their families, making labor less brutal, making farms more profitable, and ultimately making rural life more sustainable in the face of the economic pressures that were already beginning to hollow out the American countryside. If you have made it this far into the video and you are finding this history as compelling as we do, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment letting us know what has surprised you most about Round Barn so far. Your engagement genuinely helps this channel reach more people who appreciate stories like this one. What made the Round Barn particularly appealing to dairy farmers deserves deeper examination, because it was in the dairy industry that the design found its most enthusiastic reception. Dairy farming, more than almost any other branch of agriculture, is governed by the relentless rhythm of twice-daily milking. A dairy farmer's life is organized around the barn in a way that a grain farmer's is not. The barn is not a seasonal destination, but a daily necessity, and the efficiency of its layout has direct consequences for the farmer's time, energy, and ultimately income. A round dairy barn, with its central silo or haymow and its ring of milking stalls, allowed a farmer to move through the milking process with a kind of assembly line logic that the rectangular barn, with its linear rows of stalls, could not easily match. The cows could be brought in through one section of the building and released through another, reducing congestion. The milking equipment, increasingly mechanized by the early 20th century, could be positioned to serve multiple animals simultaneously. The ventilation systems that reformers recommended for dairy barns, designed to prevent the accumulation of moisture and pathogens that could sicken cattle and contaminate milk, worked more effectively in a round structure where airflow followed the curve of the walls rather than pooling in rectangular corners. We are now well into the heart of this story, and we want to pause for a moment to ask you something directly. Do you live near a round barn, or have you ever had the opportunity to visit one? There are still hundreds of these structures standing across the United States, and many of them are accessible to visitors. Share your experience in the comments below, whether you grew up driving past one or stumbled upon one unexpectedly on a road trip, or have never seen one in person but are now thinking about seeking one out. Stories from the community are what make this kind of content come alive. Yet for all its practical advantages, the Round Barn also carried with it a set of challenges that proved difficult to overcome over time. And understanding those challenges is essential to understanding why the form ultimately receded from the American landscape after its brief flowering. The most fundamental of these difficulties was the complexity of construction. Building a round barn required skills that most rural carpenters simply did not possess. Cutting lumber to fit a curved wall, framing a roof that rose to a central peak or dome, constructing a silo that integrated seamlessly with the surrounding circular structure. These were tasks that demanded precision, experience, and often specialized tools. In regions where skilled carpenters were scarce and labor costs were rising, the economies promised by the round barn's material efficiency could be quickly erased by the additional expense of construction. Many farmers who attempted to build round barns using local labor found themselves confronting delays, structural complications, and final costs that exceeded their original estimates by a discouraging margin. There was also the problem of expansion. One of the quiet virtues of the rectangular barn was that it could be extended by adding length. If a farmer's herd grew, or his need for storage increased, he could frame a new section onto the end of the existing building using familiar techniques and relatively modest resources. A round barn, by contrast, could not be expanded without destroying its essential geometry. The farmer who outgrew a round barn had no architectural recourse but to erect a second, separate structure, which undermined much of the original logic of consolidation and efficiency. In an era when American farming was beginning its long trajectory toward larger scales of operation, this inability to grow incrementally was a meaningful limitation. The early decades of the 20th century also brought changes to agricultural technology that diminished some of the round barn's defining advantages. The tractor, which began replacing horse-drawn equipment on American farms after World War I, altered the logistics of barn operation in ways the round design had not anticipated. Tractors and the mechanized implements they pulled were suited to straight-line operation for working along the length of a barn or field rather than around a curve. Feeding systems, manure removal equipment, and milking machinery were all increasingly engineered around the rectangular form. By the 1920s and 1930s, the agricultural implement industry had standardized around the straight barn to such a degree that the round barn, for all its theoretical elegance, was beginning to appear as an artifact of an earlier technological era. The cultural dimensions of the round barn's decline are at least as instructive as the practical ones. American farming in the 20th century was shaped by conformity and standardization. The rise of agribusiness pushed agriculture toward uniformity, uniform crops, uniform livestock breeds, uniform structures. The round barn, individual and eccentric, sat uneasily within this culture. Farmers who might have considered building a round barn in 1895 were, by 1935, more likely to consult an extension agent who handed them plans for a prefabricated metal building orderable from a catalogue. The craft traditions that had made the round barn possible, the patient carpentry, the accumulated local knowledge of materials and climate, were vanishing as surely as the farms themselves were being absorbed into larger operations. Before we bring this story to its conclusion, we want to extend a genuine invitation to everyone watching. If you have been following this channel for any length of time, you know that our purpose is to bring attention to the stories that conventional history tends to overlook, the designs that didn't achieve permanence, the innovations that nearly changed everything, the craftsmanship that deserves recognition long after the practitioners are gone. If that kind of content adds something meaningful to your day, share this video with someone in your life who would appreciate it. And let us know in the comments, what other piece of forgotten agricultural or architectural history would you like us to explore next? Your suggestions directly shape what we make. What remains of the round barn tradition today is a scattered and irreplaceable collection of survivors, many preserved as landmarks or repurposed as event venues and museums. Indiana alone is believed to have had more than 200 round and polygonal barns at the form's peak, and the state has made notable efforts to document and protect those that remain. The Fulton County area is sometimes described as the round barn capital of the world, drawing rural historians and photographers who come to document these structures in context. In Vermont, the round barns of the Northeast Kingdom draw visitors who find in them a combination of ingenuity and beauty that even the region's celebrated covered bridges cannot quite match. The barn at Hancock, Massachusetts, built by the Shakers nearly 2 centuries ago, has become perhaps the most visited agricultural structure in the country, drawing tens of thousands of visitors each year to what is now a living history museum. Standing inside it, watching light move through the windows onto the stone floor where cattle once stood, looking upward at the massive timber framing converging at the central peak, it is difficult not to feel something that transcends ordinary historical interest. There is a quality of intelligence embedded in the building, a tangible sense that its designers were asking genuine questions about how work could be organized more thoughtfully, how a structure could serve the people and animals within it, rather than simply replicating what had come before. The round barn also offers a lens through which to examine broader questions about innovation and adoption in American history. Why do clearly advantageous ideas sometimes fail to take root? The round barn's trajectory is a case study in the sociology of technology, a demonstration that technical merit alone is never sufficient to guarantee adoption. The design needed not only to function well, but to align with the economic conditions, the available skill base, the cultural expectations, and the technological momentum of the communities it served. When those conditions shifted, the round barn could not adapt, and it receded. This is not a straightforward story of failure. It is a story of contingency, of how the value of any design depends not on its abstract qualities, but on the particular world in which it must operate. The legacy of the round barn persists in unexpected ways. Contemporary sustainable architecture has rediscovered many of the principles that round barn builders were applying in the 19th century. The structural efficiency of curved walls, passive natural ventilation, and the logic of organizing a working space around a centrally located resource. These ideas appear in modern designs for eco-sensitive agricultural facilities and experimental farm structures. The specific form may have receded from mainstream American farming, but the thinking that produced it has been absorbed into a larger ongoing conversation about how working spaces should be designed and how the long-term operating costs of a structure ought to be weighed against the initial investment in building it well. There is something quietly instructive about driving through the Indiana or Vermont countryside and coming across one of these barns still standing at the edge of an overgrown field. The boards have weathered to silver, the roof may have partly surrendered to time, the foundation shifted through decades of frost, but the form remains unmistakable. What you are looking at is not merely an old building. It's an argument made in wood and stone and skilled labor about how the daily work of farming could be organized with greater intelligence and greater care for the people doing that work. The farmers, reformers, and carpenters who made that argument deserve to be remembered. And wherever these barns still stand, they deserve to be visited, studied, and preserved with the seriousness that genuine ingenuity has always warranted.